All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual event analyzing mismarked ballots and rejected votes in ranked choice voting. My name is Nina Taylor. I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Election Science. And before we get into the presentation and question and answer segment, I wanted to review a few housekeeping rules. We are streaming live within our educational platform, as well as YouTube, LinkedIn, and X, formerly known as Twitter. So no matter where you're watching from, we are so glad to have you here with us. Today's presentation will kick off with introductions and move into a foundational presentation of original research, and then open up with our moderator fielding your questions for the panelists. We will be collecting your questions along the way. Feel free to use the chat to ask questions of our presenters, and you'll see your questions woven into the discussion portion of the research presentation. We expect to see very, very many questions for this presentation, and we will make every effort to get to as many as possible. If we cannot get to your question, our participants have graciously agreed to answer additional questions after the presentation via email, and will post the responses in our Discord community. Whether this is your first time joining or you are a seasoned vet, we ask that you remain respectful of our presenters and each other on all platforms. While we have our differences in opinion, we would like to ensure that our educational environments and all engagements remain professional, open, and respectful of all participants. Any non-compliance of our code of conduct, you will find yourself removed from the chat. At the end of the presentation, you can expect from us an evaluation. We would love to hear your thoughts on the presentation and any ideas you may have for future web series. In this critical time in the reform community, I would like to ask you to continue to support our work. You can make a donation to the Center for Election Science on our website at electionscience.org/giving. And we encourage you to become a monthly donor. Thank you to everyone who supports our work in kind, in donation, and sharing our work with your network. So let's get into our event. We would normally not have educational sessions so close together, but given the upcoming election and their roles on the NBC decision desk, we wanted to ensure you could hear from this group before we lose them completely to the election. So I'd like to introduce to you our guest speakers. Dr. Stephen Pettigrew is the Director of Data Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania Program on Opinion Research and Election Studies, and the Deputy Executive Director of UPenn's Fox Leadership Program. He is also a Senior Analyst for the NBC News Decision Desk. His research informs discussions about access to ballot, race, representation, and effective governance. He's been published in several peer-reviewed journals, including Science, Electoral Studies, and Political Science Quarterly. He received his PhD from the Harvard Department of Government in 2017. And I'd also like to introduce to you Dr. Dylan Radley, a data research coordinator at the University of Pennsylvania's Program on Opinion Research and Election Studies. He's also an analyst for the NBC News Decision Desk. His research has focused on access to the ballot and ranked choice voting. He received his BA in political science from the University of Pennsylvania in 2023. And our moderator for the conversation today is Dr. Whitney Hua, the Director of Applied Data and Research at the Center for Election Science. Full biographies of our panelists can be found on our website at electionscience.org. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our guest presenters to share their research prior to the Q&A session. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you for having us. We're very excited to do this. If somebody could pull up the slides and I can start talking. Yeah, so this project started a couple years ago. It was actually while Dylan was still an undergrad here at Penn. And he came to me wanting to do an independent study in his last semester. Had no idea what exactly we'd focus on, but early on he came across the ballot images, the log files in Alaska of their cast votes from 2022. And so we sort of, in digging through those, we discovered that there's just so much information in there, so much data that to that point nobody had really dug into in looking at ranked choice voting. And so we very much see this project as sort of the genesis of it was recognizing that ranked choice voting is such a relatively new thing. It's been around for decades in some places, but it's really grown prominence in the last 10 or so years in a lot of places and in the policy discussion. And there really isn't, there's some work out there that does a good job of evaluating sort of the consequences of it, the benefits, the negatives to it. But this project is kind of the first one that's using actual cast vote records to assess kind of the empirical question of how often do people actually make mistakes when they're confronted with a more complicated ballot than just kind of a single mark ballot where you pick one person and then you're done for that race. And so that's very much our motivation. And our hope is that what we find here can help to inform the policy discussions around implementing ranked choice. So if you want to go to the next slide. And so kind of the big picture findings here, the question we tackle is how often do people mismark a ranked choice ballot? And what we find is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 5% of voters make some sort of mismark on their ballot in a ranked choice race. And then the secondary question is how often do those mistakes translate into their vote not actually being included in the tabulation in one form or another. And what we find is that rate of uncounted ballots is about 10 times higher than the same rate in non-ranked races on the ballot. So sort of your standard vanilla, choose one race on the ballot plurality winner. So if we go to the next slide. So to just kind of lay out a little bit of what we see as the theoretical contribution of this work, and this is obviously building on what others have had out there, but to our knowledge, like we're sort of the first research that's tried to do as best as we can to unify together what others have pointed out in other places about how you can fill out a ranked choice ballot. And so what we try to do is come up with categories for improper marks on a ranked choice ballot. And so the ballot you're looking at here, we'll talk these through, but the ballot you're looking at here has actually 3 different types of mismarks on it. And so our goal then is to sort of define those. And if we go to the next slide, what you'll see are examples of what we consider in this research to be kind of a correctly filled out ballot. So on the left, this is what we refer to as a complete ballot. And I'll actually also throw out there that these images you see are basically directly from the Alaska, the Senate race in 2022. These are real votes that people cast, and we've just sort of represented them in this way to give you a visual of what their ballot looked like whenever they filled it out. And so on the left, you can see there's 5 rankings, 5 candidates if you include the write-ins, and each candidate was selected at least once, or exactly once, I should say. On the right, this is a truncated ballot. There's different terminology out there for this type of ballot, but we go with the idea of it being truncated. And so what you can see is this voter has only selected 3 candidates and left 4 and 5 blank. We don't treat this to be sort of an improperly marked ballot. We have no way of knowing, what the voter's intent was here. And so it's very, very plausible that this voter just sincerely only wanted those 3 people to receive their vote, and so they intentionally left off Kelly Chewbacca. And so we don't consider like kind of potentially political choices to be in a form of error in our research. But if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is the first type of improperly marked ballots, which are overvotes. And so overvotes, much the same as the research out there about single mark ballots. An overvote happens when a candidate or when a voter selects multiple candidates when they were only supposed to select one, essentially. And so on the left, we have an example of an overvote where that overvote happened in ranking number 1. This voter selected both Chesbro and Chewbacca as their first choice, and then others in their second and third choice. On the right, we have a voter who selected Chesbro and Kelly as their second choice and had Chewbacca as their first. And so I'll go into this a bit later, but one of the things that's interesting about ranked choice voting is that whether or not votes get counted and how they're tabulated very much depends on how the law or the policy is is written in a particular jurisdiction. So in all the jurisdictions that we looked at, which I'll talk about in a bit, the vote on the left basically gets uncounted from the beginning, that this person overvoted on ranking number 1. And so more or less, even though this person attempted to do something here, their preferences are never included in tabulation. On the right, however, their vote is included in tabulation because Chewbacca, that was their first preference choice, and she was, because other voters had given her enough support, she was sort of never eliminated in the as they tabulate the votes and eliminate candidates. And so it didn't matter that this voter voted an overvote in ranking 2 because their ballot never moved to that second preference. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the next category of what we consider to be improperly marked ballots, which are over rankings. And so on the left, you see Murkowski was selected twice as the second and the fifth choice candidate. And on the right, you had Chewbacca being picked first, second, third, Murkowski being picked fourth and fifth. And this is where the idea here is it's really tough, particularly with what's going on the right. It's tough to say what the voter's intent was here. On the right, was the voter intending to express that Chewbacca was their first choice and that they also like Murkowski but a little bit less? Were they trying to express that actually Murkowski was at the bottom of their listing because they were putting them at the end? It's a little tougher to tell. And in terms of counting these votes, it's really tough to say. It's tough to say exactly what the voter's intent was, and then different jurisdictions use different rules for determining whether these votes get counted. And so we'll go into that in a bit. But the third one, if we go to the next slide, is what we refer to as skipping. So we saw truncated ballots are one form of skipping. That's sort of when you skip at the end, and we don't consider those to be improperly marked. But the skips that you see here in these visuals, interior skips where the voter on the left skipped the second ranking and the fourth ranking, or on the right, this is an example where you get a front skip, skipping the first or the first one or two rankings. Those are we treat these as a form of improperly marking a ballot, and this is probably where there's the most difference from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in how they treat these. Some places just pretend the skips aren't there, and on the left would just treat Murkowski as the first choice, Kelly as the second, Chewbacca as the third. Other places, if you skip too many rankings in a row, they basically terminate the counting of that ballot, even if there are markings afterward. So if we go to the next slide. So the data that we use here, this is cast vote record data from 4 different jurisdictions, basically the 4 largest places population-wise that use ranked choice. I guess Alaska is maybe a bit smaller than a couple other cities that use it. But these are kind of the most prominent in terms of size, but also in terms of which offices are being elected. So so you can get a sense of how many election dates we have and how many ranked choice offices were on those ballots. The thing to mention here, and this is certainly, this research is a work in progress. Most of these jurisdictions have only implemented ranked choice voting within the last few years. So we don't have a huge long time series of data to analyze. San Francisco's been using it since the early 2000s. Their cast vote data has only been readily available for the past couple cycles. Although I think toward the end I have a slide with some longer term data in San Francisco. But this just gives you a sense of how much data we have to work with here. We have several million votes where we're looking at the how people ranked their ballots. So if we go to the next slide, this is essentially the main I don't know what the term is, sort of the main meat of our findings. So let me just sort of orient you to this graph. So on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis there, we have skips, over rankings, and over votes, the 3 different categories of improper marks that people can make, as well as a category that's just sort of a catch-all. Did they make any of those three types of mistakes? So obviously voters can they can skip and they can overrank, and so we don't want to double count those. So on the left, those are mismarks of any type. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, this is just what percent of ballots had this type of mismarking. And so every dot or every square, triangle, diamond, whatever it is, represents a race on a ballot. So for example, in Alaska, one of those dots is the Alaska Senate race. In 2022, another dot is the Alaska House race. Other dots are all the Alaska state legislature, state Senate races in 2022. And so yeah, obviously the shapes and the colors denote which jurisdiction we're looking at. So a couple things to note here. So this is, I mentioned that about 5% of votes tend to have, or about 5% of votes have a mismarking of some kind, but you can see there's a lot of variation from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In San Francisco, basically every office that we looked at in the data that we had actually a higher mismarking rate than that 4.8. But in Alaska, almost all of them were fewer. And then you can see New York City, there's just huge variation where some offices, some races only had a 2% mismarking rate, some had a mismarking rate as high as 20%. You can also see that there's a lot of variation from place to place in terms of which types of mistakes are being made. But in particular, I want to point out that overvoting and how you can see that that's the lowest kind of bar here. It's about 0.6 of a percentage point. And we take this as positive evidence that the fact that that's the lowest is a good thing, because it tends to be the case that overvotes are the most likely type of mismarking to result in a ballot not being counted. And so that's, potentially a plus, although as you'll see later, we compare this, this overvote rate to the overvote rate in non-ranked races. And we see that, even this 0.6 being less than 1%, it's still considerably higher than what we see in other types of races. So if we go to the next slide. So then just to kind of highlight this point that we get this mismark rate of maybe as high as 5%, but that doesn't mean that 5% of votes aren't being counted. It's still considerably less than that. And let me explain a little bit why. So on the left, this is a ballot that has all three types of mistakes. There's a skip in ranking 2, Kelly is overvoted or overranked, and then in ranking 5, you have an overvote where 2 different candidates got put in ranking 5. But because of the way these ballots are tabulated and the fact that Chewbacca was among the top 2 candidates in the votes that were received, in the tabulation process, this ballot, the use of this ballot never moved beyond their first choice ranking. So the fact that they picked Chewbacca and she was among the final candidates in the final tabulation meant it didn't matter that there was a skip, an overvote, an overranking. On the right, this is a ballot that wasn't counted at all. And you can see here, this one also has every type of those mismarkings, but it wasn't counted because the first preference choice, by Alaska state law, there's no way to tell what the voters' intent was here. Did they mean to vote for Kelly? Did they mean to vote for Chewbacca? And so this person's ballot was not included in tabulation at any point. So if we go to the next slide. So just to kind of give you an idea of how high these mismarking rates are, these ballot uncountedness rates are, we have the advantage with the data that we have. Because we have these cast vote records, we can see for a given voter, how did they vote for president? How did they vote for Senate? How did they vote, in every race on their ballot, including the ranked choice ones? We don't know who the voters are, obviously, but we know how they voted. And so what we can look at is how often did they make errors when casting their ranked choice races, and compare that to the error rates on the same ballot in non-ranked choice races. So that top line there, you can see that in non-ranked choice races, which essentially in these on these ballot, with one small exception, pretty much every other race on these ballots were single mark, plurality winner type races. And in those races, you get about 0.04% of votes that go uncounted because of a mismark. In ranked choice races, when we look just at the first round of tabulation, so not even considering like, okay, let's see ballots, maybe candidates get eliminated because they didn't have enough support and so they don't make it to the final round of tabulation. Throw that aside and just look at the first round of tabulation, which is about as apples to apples as you could really get with ranked choice to a non-ranked race or a plurality race. We see in that first round of tabulation about 0.35 of a percentage point of votes get uncounted in that first round of tabulation. So we're looking at somewhere around a 9 or 10 times increase from non-ranked races to ranked races. Now, it's true, and you can look at these percentages. We're not talking about, an overwhelming number of people whose votes are being thrown out on average, but I think it's important, like in policy discussions, part of the reason we're doing this work is because we want policymakers to have this evidence in front of them and evaluate, like, is this an acceptable amount of rejected ballots? If they're okay with that, then that's fine. But I think it's kind of important to have a sense of what the difference is, what the likely impact of shifting from voting in a ranked ballot to a non-ranked, a non-ranked ballot to a ranked ballot, what that impact might be. If we go to the next slide. So this is, I don't recall if this is in the version of the paper. I don't remember if the paper was even sent around to this group, but some of these results are up on our website. One of the things that we wanted to look at was whether there were differences in ballot rejection rates by office type, because one piece of feedback we received is like ranked choice races tend to be lower salience offices, they're further down the ballot, all that sort of stuff. And so maybe when you're comparing ranked choice races in San Francisco, where it's the mayoral race and then a bunch of city supervisors, kind of local offices, maybe those are just fundamentally different than when you're voting for president or senate. What we were able to do, and this is actually, we were able to do this without cast vote records, but instead just with the San Francisco official vote results all the way back to 2007, was compare the offices on their ballot that used ranked choice to the ones that didn't use ranked choice. And so you can see that with a couple exceptions, those red points on the left, those non-ranked offices, pretty small, the percentage of people who make mistakes and subsequently have their ballots rejected in those races, right? It tends to be less than 1 in 1,000, I guess would be, I have it written down over here actually. So about somewhere between 1 in 2,000 and 1 in 600 of those ballots are rejected. But when we look at the first round of tabulation in ranked choice races, that rejection rate goes up to about 1 in 240 or so. And it's kind of chopped off a little bit here. But when you go to the final round of tabulation, it jumps up to, I want to say somewhere around like 1 in 120 or so. And so we do see, even when you're comparing to the other offices that are on the same ballot that are kind of as low salience as something like a city council race might be, we still are seeing rates that are considerably higher. So next slide. Cool. And then the last thing, and this is sort of just preliminary results that we're kind of hoping to explore more in a subsequent paper, but kind of the obvious question that folks have given to us has been, who are the people making these mistakes? And because with that information, maybe you can do a better job of educating voters and all that sort of stuff. And so the challenge with the data we have is that we obviously, your ballot is secret. We don't know the identities of the people who are casting these votes, but we do know a little bit about them. We know how they voted in other races. There's a couple other ways we've thought about trying to tease out the data a bit, but just purely using the information of which offices they voted on actually gives us a lot of information here. So this is data from Alaska, And in Alaska, they used ranked choice voting in 2022 on the Senate, House, and governor races, as well as all of their state House and state Senate races. So what we were able to do was look at the voters who voted in both the state House and state Senate races. And those are the red dots and lines. So we can look at them. We can look at the people who voted in one or the other. Those are the green dots and lines. And then the people who completely skipped the state legislative races. Those are the blues. And what we know from, frankly, like decades of political science research is that the types of people who tend to only vote in the top offices and then like roll off and skip lower down offices like state legislatures, those tend to be voters who are less engaged with politics. Often they have lower levels of formal education. Sometimes there's other kind of demographic correlates. And so what we find here is that among the people who did not vote for state legislature, the blue points on this graph, those people tend to have sometimes considerably higher error rates in the governor, Senate, and House races that they did vote in. So this kind of signals to us that maybe there's something going on here with maybe there are differences in the types of voters who are making these mistakes because the people who are basically the people filling out their entire ballot, voting on everything, they seem to be a little bit less likely to make mistakes when they're filling out the ranked choice portion of the ballot. And you can kind of draw the lines, although, obviously this is preliminary work and we want to dig more into it, but it seems to be evidence in the direction that there might be an education component to this, there may be an income component to this, as well as other things. And so that's something we want to dig into more, but I just wanted to show kind of those initial results. So next slide. So conclusions, and then we'll look forward to the Q&A. As I said, on a typical ranked choice race, roughly 1 in 20 voters make a mismark of some kind, although frankly, most of those mismarks don't result in the vote actually being uncounted. But when we compare the uncounted rates in ranked races to the ones in non-ranked races, they're about 10 times as high. And so, as I mentioned, we want to dig more into demographic differences that may affect these relationships, as well as things like the role of voting technology. So some of our data affords us the ability to compare ballots that were cast by mail to ballots that were voted in person. And one thing that we've noted, in Alaska, for example, if you fill out a paper ballot in person and you scan the ballot to have it tabulated, the tabulator may actually kick it back and say, hey, you have a mistake on this race. And voters then potentially have the opportunity to go correct that mistake if they want to. Versus somebody who votes by mail, once they've mailed it in, there's no opportunity to correct any of those errors. So that's obviously an interesting dynamic with a ballot with ranked choice races on it, just because you're asking the voter to do a little bit more than they typically would on a plurality vote. We also want to dig into other jurisdictions that use electronic machines where the machine could just be programmed to not let you or automatically prompt you if you overvote or if you overrank, those sorts of things. And so we would expect that in a place like that, maybe the error rates are less, although you still have the issue of mail ballots, that sort of stuff. So that's what we've got. We're looking forward to hearing what y'all have for questions. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. I was taking notes on that, and I can see that there have been a lot of comments. Everyone's really engaged. And so why don't we start off? And so I'll do my best to get through all the comments, and I'll try to do a little interweaving of, similar questions. I think it'll be great for us to start off with some clarifying questions, since there are a few in the comments of just kind of clarifying on the error rate classifications, right? the difference between spoiled ballots, mistakes versus rejection. So let's just clarify that language for our audience members here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when we started the paper, we were referring to everything as errors. We've sort of, it's easy to slip back into that language, but we sort of think of errors and mismarks as interchangeable. And so, so that's basically like, that's a feature of the ballot itself. And you know, the examples that we had in the images showing the different types of mismarks / errors. When we think of an uncounted, or, you know, we sort of use rejected interchangeably, we think of that as a feature of the counting process. And so, you know, obviously one of the interesting things about ranked choice races is that having an error on your ballot is sort of a feature of the voter themselves, right? The voter's the one making, you know, making all the decisions that result in the ballot having a skip or whatnot. When it comes to actually having that vote counted or uncounted, what's interesting about ranked choice voting compared to many other voting systems is that it's a function of not just how this voter voted, but how everybody else voted. Because if I, you know, we had the couple of the examples in the slides, if my first choice ranking has, you know, I select a candidate and then there's an overvote in ranking 2, whether or not that overvote becomes relevant to the tabulation of my ballot depends on how everybody else thought about the person I ranked first. Did that person actually make the second round of tabulation, or were they eliminated at some point? So hopefully that clarifies a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just add like a small note, like how I think about the idea of mismarks. You know, there's clear instructions for the voter where they're supposed to assign one candidate per ranking, right? And so a deviation from that, right, will end up being either a skip, an overranking, or an overvote, right? And so we think of it as mismarks or deviations from the rules that were laid out for the voters.
Awesome. And if anyone needs further clarification, right, please follow up in the comments section. We'll move on to kind of the variance of across jurisdictions and those breadth of questions there. And we'll start with Dr. Lindsay Cormack's question here on, can you tell us about ballot rejection rates? Ooh, I just clicked on that and then I'm going to feature it right there. And about ballot rejection rates in different parts of a state / locality. So like, are fewer ballots rejected in places that tend to have wealthier or less wealthy residents?
Yeah, so great question. And hi, Lindsay. Glad to see you're here. So we're super interested in the question. We don't really have a solid answer yet. It's definitely something we want to dig more into. So the cast vote records we have in most but not all of the jurisdictions, we're pretty confident that we can map each vote back to the precinct that the voter was assigned to. Although these are essentially like machine log files that took us the better part of 6 or 8 months to really understand everything in them, but we're pretty certain we can map the votes back to the precinct that they were assigned to. And so with that, you know, the hope in what we want to explore in the future is seeing whether precincts, voting locations that have, you know, higher levels of income or lower levels of income, or higher concentrations of white voters or non-white voters or college educated vote, you know, all the different demographics you could imagine. We want to see whether we can see differences in the precinct level error rates between different demographic groups. And so it's not something we've dug into. I think that the Alaska stuff is maybe a little bit suggestive. That graph I showed at the end is a little bit suggestive of the idea that that people who are more likely to roll off on their ballot are also more likely to make mistakes, and we know a good bit about roll off, and so that kind of points us in a direction, but we don't have a solid answer yet on that other piece.
Right, and to look more specifically into, you know, areas. Okay, I'm trying to click a comment here, but
Software's
I
really
will just read it
fancy.
out loud. I know it is fancy. If only I knew how to, how many doctors does it take to screw in a light bulb kind of thing. I'm trying to click it again, but I will just read it out loud. I do enjoy, reading questions out loud. From a Marcus Ogren, have you looked into some of the outliers in your data set? Thank you. Such as the main race, in which over 20% of voters ranked the same candidate multiple times, or the plurality race, in which around 1.5% of ballots had an overvote. So in these specific cases, do you take a look at outliers and kind of do a little bit more of that narrative digging in the back?
Yeah, for sure we have. Because we're taking all this data from these raw machine logs, so much of the work we put in was making sure what we had was right, that the data as we had essentially reconstructed it was reflective of what the actual results look like. So the easiest way to do that was to basically get what we believe is the configuration of everybody's ballot, apply the ranked choice rules, and do the tabulation for every race in those jurisdictions, and then compare to the final results. And in every one of our jurisdictions, we were able to do that perfectly, with the one exception of Alaska, where we're missing like 200 votes for some reason out of the full state of several million. And we've dug into it a bit, but everything comes out basically the same. So we've done a lot of validation. So we're confident that those outliers are in fact outliers and not like mistakes on our part. The main one, that one, Dylan, do you remember? I think it was in Maine 2 in 2022. Is that what it was from?
So that's a case that we want to try and look at a little bit more. I believe that's the Polkwin race, where the Republican candidate told people not to rank other candidates. And there's actually research. I forget the author of the paper, but it's been looked at in the past as an indication of if candidates instruct voters to fill out these ballots in a particular way, does that impact, right? Now, if the candidate instructed them to overrank, that's not something we've been able to find, right? And that would be really interesting to know, like if there was messaging from the campaign that could have influenced voters, that would be very valuable information, in part because there's kind of a question that we aren't able to fully answer in our paper of why voters are doing these things. Because they could be doing it because they're being told by campaigns in some cases. They could be doing it because they don't understand the instructions, and they may be confused by the instructions. And so it's important to establish, why voters are doing this. And that's something that we aren't able to do in the paper. But outliers like the one in Maine may point to some cases where there could be outside factors besides just the voters' interaction with the ballot.
Yeah. The other thing I'll add to that, you asked about the plurality race with a pretty high overvote rate. And I don't remember looking into that one as much, but that is actually a really good question and probably worth digging into a bit more. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think one thing is clear is right from the beginning, I think the presentation really tapped into the dearth of, it's one of the academic words we really love, right? But the dearth of research in this area, especially when considering kind of the past decade was really where we see more research being done in this area, right? And you said yourselves that RCV, given its time around, even with RCV, it hasn't really been implemented since at the earliest in the early 2000s, right? So with that being said, and given that there is a lack of research, but what are your thoughts on, so Whitty Campbell asked this question, has there been any research about the rate of overvotes for the first round of top 2 primaries? So how often do people accidentally pick 2 candidates when told that only the top 2 candidates advance? And so there is a lack of research, but maybe who better to ask than you both, right? And then this kind of ties in well with the question right above it from an anonymous person, but asking about how does the error rate and rejection rate of RCV compare to other methods? So like approval voting, star voting, right? Score range that are not the common status quo, select one, plurality method.
Yeah. So to the first question, it's a great question. I have no idea what the answer is and whether there even is any research. Instead of calling it a dearth of research, I like to think that this research is expanding rapidly from zero to something that's not zero. But yeah. So I don't actually know, but that's a great point, that voters may not fully understand what it means for an office to be a top two primary. And I don't actually California is the big spot where that uses top two primaries. And I don't, maybe somebody in the chat even knows the answer to this, but I don't know whether that's actually even, whether that language appears on the ballot or not, or whether the ballot just says pick somebody like it would in a normal race, and then the top two aspect is just a tabulation thing. I don't know the answer to that. To their question about comparing the error rates of ranked choice to other methods, we unfortunately also don't have a great answer to that. And partly because, as probably most people here know, is that after kind of the traditional select one plurality method, the next most common at this point, I would say, is ranked choice. I guess you have some multi-candidate systems in a lot of places for local offices, but basically, like, if we're thinking about things like approval voting or star voting or those sorts of methods, there's not a lot of places that use those, and so we don't know the answer to that. As far as I've come across, I don't know of any of those places that use those methods, whether they even make available the type of data that we used here that would allow us to kind of essentially replicate this exercise on those to make that direct comparison. I'm not familiar with any work on that. I'd love to see someone do it or to work on it myself if those data existed, but it's one of those challenges of, with any policy implementation, but frankly, especially policy implementations in the election space, you can have a guess at how it's going to go, but until it's in voters' hands, until you actually have some real data from some real voters, it's real hard to know the consequences of how voters are going to interact with the new system until you've done it. And so, yeah.
I'll just add to that. The difficulty, I think, is that voters aren't encountering these other voting methods in the wild as much. So there isn't as much incentive to research how voters are interacting with it. I mean, there isn't a ton of research on ranked choice voting, in part because it's just now kind of entering center stage. I will say that there is a paper. I'm just trying to find it. Yeah. So Malloy and Ward in 2021 did a paper, The Impact of Input Rules and Ballot Options on Voting Error and Experimental Analysis. I'll throw it in the chat. And they did an experiment, and they had voters interact with a ranked ballot, and then I don't remember all of the alternative methods they used, and then a plurality ballot. And they, did evaluate how voters interacted with it in that experimental setting, but we haven't really seen research on how actual voters interact with it in an election, because they don't.
Yeah, that's very much like doing an experiment is as close as you can really get in the absence of a real election. But like, researchers like to talk about the external validity of an experiment. I mean, there's a big question of whether having somebody fill out a fake ballot in kind of a sterilized kind of experiment situation, if that's really reflective of what people are going to experience when they actually go to the polling booth in November. So
that's very true. CS is also conducting an experiment in which we presented on the same panel at Ezra this last year, which is how we came across your excellent research, right? And we prefer clinical setting versus sterile.
That's a better term. I will agree on
that. But yes, and I guess I wouldn't say a dearth. And to repeat what you said previously, I think it's the lack of really attentive, I would say, research that kind of really and comprehensively looks at the impact, right? Especially with the reform that is growing in popularity and implementation, especially with all the jurisdiction variants, right? And so when we're thinking about how they count, discount ballots, right, with skipped rankings, how each jurisdiction can treat and how it can vary really between jurisdictions. How do different RCV implementations, so we're saying like maybe single winner, maybe versus multi-winner RCV, impact the rate of ballots that are mismarked?
I think that's a great question, but it's another thing that we don't address in the paper. And in part, like we can't address it because, you know, it's that system isn't being used in the jurisdictions that we're looking at. I don't know if you have anything to add, Stephen.
No, I think yeah.
But yeah.
Oh, let's also give a shout out to the efforts of collecting this data. How long did it take you both and your team to collect this data for a system, right, that has been around for a little bit, right? But this was not an easy feat.
Fortunately, so all the jurisdictions we used in the study, if we're thinking of collect as just literally the like getting our hands on the raw data, it's all out there publicly. Like they're all just posted on websites. But I'll let Dylan give a little back. I mentioned that this started as an independent study of his in his last semester here at Penn. I'll let him talk. Yeah.
So the answer is the whole semester. You know, admittedly, more than that. Well, so we started in Alaska, and it was, you know, ranked choice voting was something I was aware of, and I, you know, I was interested in it, but I wasn't necessarily planning to do research on it. And so I found the file, and I would describe it to friends as a Russian nesting doll of pain, because it's just, you know, you try to peel back a layer of this log file, and then you just uncover more just things that you had to, you know, decipher and figure out how to unpack it and put it all together. So we spent the entirety of my final semester working together on this. So that was a few months of work, and that was just to get things set in Alaska. Now, that being said, after we'd kind of cut our teeth in Alaska, it was a bit easier to manage data from some of the other places. But, you know, different places have different formats. And there were, I remember, Stephen, you had a lot of difficulties with New York City's data. I'm sure Dr. Cormack can maybe sympathize with you or provide advice. But, you know, we had a lot of difficulties, but it was definitely easier once we had gotten a handle on it, though it took a few months.
The answer is it took a while, it took a long time, but I like projects like this because I like projects where you know what you're supposed to get at the end, right? Like we knew what the final vote counts were supposed to be. So if we were able to write code that clean the data, and then at the end of the day, we get the precise vote count in every single race on the ballot, we know we've done it right. And it took us 6 or 8 months to get there, but then when we got there, we were like, all right, now we can do it. So it was, it's a challenge.
Hilarious. That was one of the most graphic representations of working with difficult and challenging data sets. It was very graphic, and I enjoyed it. Thank you, Dylan. I will be using that from now on. The Russian doll of pain is really good, because I, for one, have definitely worked with ordinal data before, you know, with vote, you know, where you rank these ballots, right? And then especially with different ways of counting. But for the most part, it's STV, right? So single transferable vote is the kind of the standard in vote counting. So how did that play a role in kind of accounting for the data, right? I'm sure that was one layer, at least one, or I would guess 2 layers of the Russian doll of pain, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, Dylan, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, so for, you know, that actually the Russian nesting doll, that was just getting the preferences, right? But then there was this whole other layer of, when we wanted to verify the results, we essentially had to kind of the tabulation process, right? And ensure that we got the same result. And I think somebody in the chat asked a question about this of, you know, did you look at the different ways for how the ballots are tabulated? And we did. And that's how we were able to make distinctions where in Alaska, if you skip more than one ranking. So like, let's say you ranked for the first and you skipped second and third, then those subsequent rankings are not going to be counted, because if you skip more than once, they start counting it. They stop counting. But in other jurisdictions, they will just hop over any number of skips. So in San Francisco, if you rank one candidate for your first ranking and then you go all the way to like the 5th ranking, right? They're just going to basically treat that 5th ranking as your second choice, right? And not to go on a tangent, but that actually leads to a very interesting outcome where, you know, if a voter is, you know, let's say they like a candidate, they rank them first, but they really dislike candidate B and they rank them last, but they don't put anything in between. Depending on the jurisdiction, they could end up accidentally casting a vote for candidate B, who they strongly dislike. And I think that kind of, you know, people have asked, you know, why are we calling them mismarks when they, you know, it's still resulting in a counted ballot? The thing we're interested in is voters are trying to translate their preferences through a different kind of ballot. And these mismarks, even if they end up being counted, they open up plenty of opportunities where you can't be confident that the voters' preferences are being expressed in the way that they mean for them to be expressed. And that example I just gave of the skipping it is one way that can potentially happen.
Just to underscore that again, because I think when very early on in the process, when we were thinking about, you know, the policy implementation of this stuff, one of the things that I think you and I think we're at a consensus that like, oh, well, the places that just ignore skips, that seems like how you should do it. That like, if you skip, that shouldn't cause your subsequent, you know, choices to not be counted. But then we came to realize, and this was, you know, we saw this a lot in Alaska, where in the House race up there in 2022, you get a first choice vote for the Democrat, Peltola, and then you'd have a skip, and then a vote for Palin, Sarah Palin, as the last choice. And it just, knowing those people, it seems like the expression there of preference is, I really like the Democrat and I really dislike Palin. But I mean, Alaska, in Alaska, because they terminate the ballot after 2 skips, it wouldn't have been counted. But if a similar situation like that happened in San Francisco or New York, then you could have a weird situation where a person who is trying to express a dislike for Palin ends up their vote being counted. You know, if the counting goes in a particular way, their vote goes toward the person they were trying to express. So it's like, the point is like, there's not a right way. Even something that from the beginning we thought, oh, well, clearly it's better to just ignore skips. But like, sometimes voters are using skips to express a preference in and of themselves. And that's tough. Like, there's not a solid answer to the right way to deal with it.
When it's such a delicate balance, right? And I think this touches on multiple comments and questions in the comment section. But just to highlight kind of, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't want to assume voter preferences, right? When it comes to, and when it comes to reforms that changes the way we vote, right? So like ranked choice, and how does voter education factor into that? Since it seems like there is a learning curve here that seemingly should have, you know, I'm guessing after a certain time period of experience, especially if we were to consider San Francisco, right? That's been using and has implemented RCV since the early 2000s. How long is too long? Not to sound like a news reporter, but how long is too long before we say enough is enough, right? That's just my
yeah. I mean, it's so in you know, this is, I would say when we presented this work in the past, this is often like one of the number one questions we get is, okay, well, in a world where we're using ranked choice rate voting, like what's the best way to educate voters? What are the best mechanisms? And it's hard to answer that question. And I would point to, you know, from our presentation, like it is kind of problematic that San Francisco doesn't have error rates that are less than all these other places. These other places, you know, Alaska had among the lowest, and yet Alaska was their first time around. So maybe that's a plus, although maybe my understanding is that Alaska did their you know, election secretary of state or election, whatever the state agency that runs their elections, they did a huge effort to educate voters that first time around. But are they going to do that forever, right? Like 20 years from now, when you have a massive batch of voters who weren't even living in Alaska are eligible this time around and didn't learn it in the first place, will there be as much effort in educating them? Because what we see in San Francisco is that San Francisco has error rates that are way higher than a lot of other places, even though they've been using this system since 2006, 2004, something like that. It's been almost 20 years. And that to me stands out as like, we should be thinking more about this. And frankly, there just needs to be more work on, what's
there's a dearth
driving that, and whether there's a solution. Yeah, whether there is a solution, and whether that solution is one that can be. Is there a solution in ballot design that, like, you can design the ballot in a way that maybe makes it less likely for people to have for people to make mistakes, or does it need to be like an active education campaign, which then is like, you need funding for those sorts of things and all that. That's tougher. That's a tougher endeavor.
One thing I'll just add to that as like a point of clarification, because this has come up, is, some people point out San Francisco's been doing it for so long, do you have earlier races where they had really high error rates that are pulling up your average? And just to clarify that, when we are comparing San Francisco and saying it has higher error rates, that's just looking at recent elections, right? Because obviously, the amount, we discussed this in the chat, the amount of rankings they can use has changed over the years. Their ballot design has changed over the years. But we're, when we look at the most recent elections that we had data for, where they're using ranked choice voting, we find the error rates that we found. And so, I think that there should be future research trying to understand these large differences between jurisdictions, because it is really interesting and there's clearly a lot of factors at play.
All right. And so I think we're coming up on time. So let's have one last question. And Jackie Cota from Alameda County, California, seems to have some on the grounds experience, right, in trying to administer, or at least having experience with the NorCal jurisdictions that have implemented RCV. So maybe we can feature this this latest comment by her about Oakland and Berkeley, right? So over 10 years. And so when it comes to voter education and also just in practice, it seems like there is a very serious learning curve that people don't know how RCV works. And I think you both tapped into it as to not just the education portion, but then also what about for practitioners, right? So maybe like elected officials and administration practitioners, right? People who have to administer it, since it's not precinct subbable, right? So a lot of these, and there is a variety of ways in ranked choice has been implemented in the past, whether it be you have to vote in person, but then there's also the technology component, right? So I guess relevant to what Jackie's comments are about, what would your thoughts be on that?
I mean, I think this kind of feeds into one of the big takeaways for me from this project, which is that it's hard enough to get a lot of people to even show up to vote, right? And for them to even just pick a candidate for races, to vote their whole ballot, right? Like a lot of people only vote the top of the ballot and then roll off. And so I think when we're thinking about voter, ballot reforms, those sorts of things that essentially are asking a voter to do more than just pick one single person and then be done. I think that it's really important that we have good evidence that suggests that the outcomes are going to be better as a result of that reform. And it's, what outcomes are we talking about? Like, well, there's a lot of them, and it gets into like a normative or policy discussion of like, frankly, like what are elections for? What are they meant to do? I mean, that's obviously beyond the scope of this project, but I do think like at a fundamental level, the more not the more complicated a ballot is, but the more you ask a voter to do on their ballot, the more likely you are to have, people making mistakes. And the flip side of that is to say, if a ballot is simpler, people are going to be less apt to make a mismark on it. And so when we're thinking about reforms that are less simple, I mean, that's just true. I mean, any of these reforms are less simple. I think it's important that we weigh the potential benefits against, the possibility that certain voters are, going to be more likely to make mistakes. And maybe in the worst case, although, we don't have evidence of this in what we've done so far, but it could be the case that you might be having voter preferences misrepresented because maybe certain types of voters are more likely to have their votes rejected. And so those types of voters aren't getting their candidates, their candidates are a little bit less well off. That's, it's kind of, that last piece is a little bit speculative on my part and certainly requires more of the work that we plan to do. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add. I think another thing that comes out of our research, I wouldn't characterize any of this as like rigging or anything like that. I think we've kind of just shown a light on how difficult these choices can make. We went through this hypothetical of if somebody ranks, if somebody ranks a Democrat first and then, a Republican last, and like, somebody like Peltola, somebody like Palin, it's difficult to understand how to count that ballot, right? And, it's not really like a rigging choice, right? These like rules are laid out beforehand, but like there isn't a correct choice. And how voters interact with their ballots can interact with the tabulation process in very complicated ways. And, there's a lot more research on that. And, that's just something that we're adding.
An analogy, just as a last thought, an analogy I'll throw out there is, when you're counting ranked choice ballots, the choices you have to make about how you deal with skips and other things, on some level, there's a little bit of arbitrariness. You just have to pick a route. That's the case with a lot of policies. Frankly, it's not even, there's other examples of arbitrary choices that happen when ballots are, when we write ballots. It's arbitrary that we would put president first and then Senate and then governor. Why couldn't you just put the dog catcher first and bury president at the end? There are some places that have ballot designs like that, but it's not that ranked choice is unique in that there's these kind of arbitrary decisions that have to be made. It's just that the other kind of arbitrary decisions we made, everybody has settled on being okay, and ranked choice is such a new thing that there's not a correct way to do it, a best practice necessarily yet. So I think that's kind of important to remember as well.
Great. Those are some awesome final thoughts. And I think hopefully the example of, it's definitely going to resonate with me, the Alaska example with the two different candidate preferences, right? That voter expression is already challenging to capture as it is, right? And so making assumptions is hardly our role, especially as researchers, but hardly a role even as election administrators, right? And so there is a QR code for the post-event feedback survey. Here we go. Thank you. Wow, love that, right? It's like I almost queued it up myself, but I didn't. Thank you to everyone who attended and for being a part of this really exciting conversation. And please do reach out if you have any lingering questions, comments, love notes, etc. for our speakers today. Here's a round of applause because I don't think you get to hear it. So imagine that being multiplied by a bunch. So yes, please do take our survey and we will see you at our next event. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.